They thought I was just another newcomer, just another quiet couple moving into their perfect little neighborhood. But when the HOA tried to force us into their rules, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Because I wasn't just another homeowner. I was trained for war, and this time, the battlefield was my street. The sun rested gently over Maplewood Estates, that quiet, almost picture-perfect suburb that looked more like a real estate magazine cover than a real place. White fences lined the sidewalks, kids played on electric scooters, and manicured lawns sparkled under the golden light. To anyone driving by, it was the kind of place where peace lived. But peace, I'd learned, was only an illusion. And in neighborhoods like this, it was usually guarded by the most dangerous people of all, the ones who wore smiles instead of badges. My wife and I had just moved in. After years of service overseas, I was ready for quiet, a small house, a big sky, and a chance to build something that didn't involve orders or combat. We chose this neighborhood because it looked safe, organized, and clean. The kind of place where nothing unexpected ever happened. Or so we thought. The moving truck pulled away, leaving us standing on the fresh driveway, two strangers among perfect strangers. My wife's smile was genuine, full of hope. Mine was cautious. The air felt too rehearsed, like everyone had been trained to behave a certain way. Perfect posture, perfect lawns, perfect hell. The first person we met was her, Karen Davenport, HOA President, according to the shiny badge on her clipboard. She had the kind of energy that filled the space before her words even arrived. Her walk was brisk, her posture commanding, her tone, polite but sharp, like a knife wrapped in sugar. Behind her followed two assistants, each holding a stack of papers that looked thicker than a deployment manual. She introduced herself with an exaggerated smile that didn't touch her eyes, and immediately began explaining how things worked around here. She spoke of community guidelines, dues, appearance standards, and weekly meetings. It wasn't a welcome, it was a checklist. I nodded out of courtesy, but inside, something already felt wrong. There was no warmth. No genuine curiosity about who we were. Just control. Rules. Power. That night, as we unpacked boxes, I noticed something strange. A folded pamphlet slipped through our door. Join the HOA, for the good of the community. The words felt less like an invitation and more like an order. My wife laughed it off, saying every neighborhood had people like that. But I'd learned long ago that small authority, in the wrong hands, could be far more dangerous than a loaded rifle. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure began to mount. Karen's clipboard became a permanent part of the scenery. She inspected lawns, measured fence heights, and even counted the number of trash bins on driveways. She'd leave printed warnings taped to doors: non-compliance notice, community standard violation, pending review. Neighbors didn't argue. They complied. Fast. But when she knocked on our door again, she didn't bring a warning. She brought a demand. She wanted us to join the HOA. I listened carefully, saying little. She explained the mandatory membership requirement, the rules of engagement, and the code of neighborly conduct. Her tone carried that same sugar-coated authority, the kind that expects obedience before explanation. But here's the thing about soldiers: we don't respond well to threats disguised as kindness. I politely declined. The silence that followed felt colder than winter. She blinked, smiled tightly, and said she'd follow up soon. And when she left, I knew this wasn't over. That evening, the whispers began. Neighbors who used to wave suddenly looked the other way. One man mowing his lawn avoided eye contact altogether. Another woman who had offered my wife cookies last week now pulled her kids inside when we walked past. The shift was subtle, but undeniable. Something had changed, and it was spreading fast. I noticed a car parked outside our house late at night. Same model, same time, every night for 3 days straight. Headlights off. Engine running for a few minutes before disappearing down the street. I'd seen enough reconnaissance to recognize surveillance when I saw it. On the fourth night, I stepped out silently, phone camera ready. The car sped off. But I caught a glimpse of the driver, one of Karen's assistants from that first day. I didn't tell my wife. No need to scare her yet. But I began to take notes: license plates, times, patterns. Old habits die hard. Then came the letter. It wasn't handwritten. It wasn't signed. Just typed in bold. Failure to join the HOA may result in community action. Community action. Those two words stuck like a splinter in my mind. The next morning, our trash cans were knocked over. A day later, someone spread fertilizer across our driveway, leaving chemical stains. And by the weekend, a bright red notice of violation was nailed to our mailbox, even though we weren't members. I wasn't angry yet. Not really. Anger was easy. But what I felt instead was something sharper: alertness. Awareness. The kind that comes before a storm. Karen thought she was playing a neighborhood game of power. She had no idea that the man she was trying to intimidate once trained teams to handle psychological warfare, surveillance, and civilian manipulation tactics in combat zones. The HOA had their rules. I had my own. As the sun set behind the manicured trees, I made a silent decision. I would find out exactly how far they were willing to go. And when they crossed the line, I'd be waiting. Because this wasn't just about joining an HOA anymore. This was about drawing a line between control and freedom. And for the first time since moving here, I was ready for battle again. The following week, the neighborhood didn't feel like the same place. The air carried an unspoken tension, the kind that doesn't make noise, but you feel it in your bones. Every smile felt rehearsed. Every neighborly wave seemed to hide a question behind it. I'd seen this kind of shift before, in outposts overseas, when morale changed right before an operation. The same rhythm. The same silence before movement. And I knew, without a doubt, the HOA wasn't finished with me. It started small. Harmless, if you looked at it alone. One morning, the sprinklers on my front lawn stopped working, perfectly timed, just after I'd finished fixing them the day before. That same afternoon, I found a notice of lawn neglect taped to my door, printed in red ink. The message wasn't signed, but I didn't need a name. The font, the phrasing, the tone, it all screamed Karen. I didn't react. Not yet. Reaction was what they wanted: frustration, confrontation, escalation. But I'd learned long ago that patience was the deadliest weapon a man could have. So I watched. And in watching, I began to see the patterns. Karen didn't act alone. She had lieutenants, a small circle of loyal neighbors who carried out her bidding like clockwork. The kind who'd report grass height, garbage schedules, or even the way curtains were drawn. They weren't bullies, they were believers. And that made them dangerous. At the weekly community meeting, which I didn't attend, they announced a new neighborhood improvement initiative. On the surface, it sounded harmless, a campaign to encourage property conformity. But in practice, it was their way of publicly naming and shaming non-members. Our address was the first one on the list. That evening, as my wife watered the plants, I noticed two men taking photos from across the street, clipboards in hand, marking things down like investigators at a crime scene. My wife looked confused, almost hurt, asking why they were doing this. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't know, but because she didn't deserve the worry that came with the truth. Inside the house, I installed cameras. Discreet. Hidden in motion lights, mailbox corners, and even the birdhouse by the fence. It wasn't paranoia. It was documentation. Evidence. If this HOA wanted to play games, I was going to play smarter. But Karen didn't need permission to escalate. 2 days later, I came home to find a bright orange tag on my front door. Property in violation, subject to review. No explanation. No number to call. Just the HOA's logo at the top, stamped like a brand. The same night, my wife's car tires were slashed. For clean cuts, precise and deliberate. Not vandalism, message delivery. And when I checked the footage from my cameras, I saw it clearly: a familiar figure in a pale windbreaker, clipboard in hand, looking both ways before stepping out of frame. Karen's assistant. The same one who had been watching from that parked car weeks ago. That's when the line was crossed. They'd turned from nuisance to threat. And threats, I handle those differently. Still, I didn't go to the police. I didn't post about it online. I knew what would happen. Karen would twist the story, call it misunderstanding, use her HOA network to bury the truth. I needed to play it the way I knew best: quiet, calculated, invisible. The next morning, I walked around the neighborhood like nothing happened. I smiled, waved, made small talk with whoever would make eye contact. But I was scanning, not just faces, but behaviors. Who avoided me? Who watched me too long? Who whispered after I passed? It became clear, the HOA's influence was deeper than I thought. Karen's control reached into everything: neighborhood maintenance contracts, lawn services, even mail routes. Everyone owed her something. Everyone feared falling out of line. Except me. When she arrived at my house again, she didn't come alone this time. 2 men in suits, probably other HOA board members, flanked her sides. Their smiles were plastic, but their presence was a message. Power in numbers. I opened the door halfway, enough to hear her out. She spoke calmly, as if nothing unusual had happened. She said the HOA had unanimously voted to require my membership due to community integration needs. I could tell she rehearsed every word. And that's when I realized the truth: this wasn't about rules or regulations. It was about control. Karen wasn't protecting a neighborhood. She was building an empire, one compliant homeowner at a time. As she talked, I noticed the subtle things: the way her eyes darted around, scanning the camera above my door. The way her voice tightened when she said, "You'll find it easier to just sign." The way her men kept their hands inside their jackets, almost like guards waiting for a signal. This wasn't a conversation. It was an intimidation tactic. But she still didn't know who she was dealing with. I let her talk until she felt confident, powerful, until she believed she'd won the psychological upper hand. Then, calmly, I stepped closer, just enough for her to catch the steadiness in my posture, the quiet confidence of someone who wasn't scared. I said nothing. I didn't need to. Sometimes silence says more than words ever could. When she left, she looked unsettled, not because of anything I said, but because she couldn't read me. Control only works when the other person reacts. I hadn't given her that satisfaction. The next few days were eerily quiet. No letters. No tags. No warnings. For a moment, my wife thought it was over. But I knew better. This was the calm before retaliation. Late one night, I heard something, faint, like footsteps near the side of the house. I turned off the lights and watched through the blinds. 3 silhouettes moved near my garage, flashlights in hand. They weren't kids. They moved too carefully, too coordinated. They were looking for something. Evidence. Or leverage. I didn't confront them. Not yet. Instead, I recorded everything. Every movement, every angle, every timestamp. I wanted proof. By morning, the story would change again. And this time, I wasn't going to stay silent. Because I finally understood, this wasn't just about forcing me to join the HOA. It was about breaking me. And that was never going to happen. Not to me. Not in my house. Not in this lifetime. As the first light of dawn hit the neighborhood, I made a decision. It was time to stop defending. It was time to take control. The sun rose over Maplewood Estates like nothing had happened. Sprinklers hissed, dogs barked, and the familiar hum of lawnmowers filled the air. But beneath that calm, something darker moved, quiet, deliberate, organized. And this time, it wasn't the HOA. It was me. I'd spent my entire adult life learning how to dismantle systems from the inside, terrorist cells, rogue militias, underground operations that thrived on fear and silence. The tactics were all the same. Control the flow of information, isolate the target, and break them through psychological pressure. That's exactly what the HOA had been doing. And now, I was going to turn their own playbook against them. Step 1 was reconnaissance. I started by mapping out everything, every HOA board member, every assistant, every loyal neighbor who'd become Karen's eyes and ears. I made note of their routines, their vehicles, their alliances. Who mowed their lawns? Who took out their trash? Who met who, and when? It was methodical. Slow. But it built a picture, a network of control that stretched far beyond the homeowners association. Karen had built a miniature regime, one that ran on intimidation disguised as organization. Through public county records, I found that she and her board controlled nearly every maintenance contract in the neighborhood, landscaping, garbage collection, even pest control. Each business conveniently linked to relatives or friends of the HOA. Money was flowing quietly, through dues, fines, and fake community improvement fees. And every homeowner who resisted faced what we did: harassment, isolation, vandalism masked as enforcement. I'd seen this structure before, only difference was, this time, the battlefield was a cul-de-sac. Step 2 was surveillance. The cameras I'd installed had already paid off once, but now I upgraded. Motion sensors, night vision units, and a wireless hub feeding directly into my private drive. I wanted eyes everywhere, not for paranoia, but precision. The footage told a story. A small team of HOA volunteers roamed the streets at night, marking driveways, photographing houses, checking compliance. Their schedules were predictable. Their patrol routes repeated every 3 nights. Karen was running her own private neighborhood police force. And just like any army, her power relied on loyalty and fear. I planned to dismantle both. It began with exposure. Using open public access laws, I compiled the HOA's financial filings, or rather, the ones they claimed to submit. The inconsistencies were glaring. Overcharged landscaping expenses. Duplicate invoices. Community funds, labeled for non-existent projects. It was all there. Hidden in plain sight. But evidence was worthless without witnesses. And most of the neighbors were too afraid to talk. That's where my training kicked in, not as a soldier, but as a strategist. Instead of confronting Karen, I started helping people quietly. Fixing fences for the elderly couple down the block. Repainting the mailbox of a single mom whose warnings from the HOA kept piling up. Small acts, but they built something Karen couldn't control: trust. And with trust came information. Whispers about fines that didn't make sense. Notices that came without cause. Threats of property seizure for missed dues. I documented everything. My wife didn't fully understand the depth of what I was doing. She only saw me working late nights, typing reports, reviewing footage, studying files. But she trusted me. And that trust was the only thing that kept me steady. Then, one evening, my cameras caught something unexpected. Karen herself, standing outside my fence, after dark. Alone. Clipboard in hand, scanning something with her phone. She was marking coordinates, probably for another inspection. But she lingered. Longer than usual. Her posture wasn't confident this time. She looked around nervously, then took a photo of my security camera and left quickly. That was her first mistake. Because now, I knew she was worried. When leaders start looking over their shoulders, their empires crumble faster than they were built. Step 3, Infiltration. I volunteered for one of the HOA's open, community service days. Karen didn't expect that, but she couldn't refuse it either. Declining a volunteer offer would expose her bias. So she smiled, pretended to welcome me, and assigned me to Neighborhood Watch Coordination. Perfect. The position gave me access to internal emails, patrol lists, and community updates. Hidden among friendly reminders and lawn care tips were encrypted links to board-only documents, digital control centers disguised as spreadsheets. From those, I uncovered everything. Karen's emails to her board members were full of coded instructions. Non-compliant lot, initiate review. Repeat violator, approve enforcement. Potential troublemaker, monitor closely. And then I found it, a folder labeled, Priority Cases. Inside were photos of me, my wife, and our house. Notes attached. Refuses membership. Displays defiance. Potential threat to HOA harmony. Consider escalation. I sat in silence, staring at the words. This wasn't about community at all. This was personal. She wanted to make an example out of me, to prove no one could resist her authority. But in that moment, something inside me clicked. For weeks, I'd been reacting, responding, defending. That ended now. It was time to strike back. Step 4, Disruption. Every empire falls when communication collapses. So I began quietly disconnecting the HOA's invisible strings. I printed anonymous letters and slipped them into mailboxes, real HOA records, financial proofs, and screenshots of hidden invoices. No accusations, just facts. Let the truth whisper where fear once shouted. The next HOA meeting didn't go as planned. Neighbors argued, demanded answers, questioned Karen's spending. I wasn't there, but I didn't have to be. The chaos played out exactly as I predicted. That night, her patrol stopped for the first time in weeks. Karen tried damage control. She sent new notices, new warnings, desperate emails calling for unity. But the trust she'd built had cracked, and once fear disappears, control follows. Still, she wasn't giving up. Not yet. 3 days later, a certified letter arrived in my mailbox, an official cease and desist order from the HOA. She accused me of interfering with community operations and warned of legal action if I continued my disruptive behavior. I almost laughed. She still thought she was in charge. But I wasn't just gathering evidence anymore. I was preparing for the endgame. Because if Karen wanted a war, she was about to get one. And this time, it wouldn't be fought in meetings or memos. It would be fought in the light of truth. As I stood on my porch that night, the cool wind brushing against my face, I looked around the neighborhood, the same pristine lawns, the same shining fences. But I could feel it now. The shift. The fear was gone. People were starting to see through the illusion. And Karen. She was running out of control to cling to. The next phase was already set in motion. I called it Operation Homefront. And when it was done, Maplewood Estates would never be the same again. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, the neighborhood didn't feel like the same place anymore. The air carried something different, not fear, not tension, but awareness. The illusion of perfection had cracked, and through it, truth was leaking out. Slowly. Quietly. But enough for people to start asking questions. Karen Davenport, self-proclaimed president of Maplewood Estates, could sense it too. The cracks in her empire were growing. The whispers were louder. The looks, sharper. And control, her favorite currency, was slipping through her fingers. But she wasn't the kind to back down. Not yet. When tyrants feel their power threatened, they don't surrender, they tighten their grip. So she did exactly that. She doubled HOA patrols. Ordered new, community integrity checks. Sent letters to every house, reminding them of mandatory compliance and expected loyalty. But it was too late. The trust was gone. I watched it all unfold from my porch, the quiet observer of a system I had already infiltrated and exposed. The seeds of truth I'd planted had taken root. Neighbors who once obeyed her without question now began to resist. They didn't wave anymore when she passed. Some even ignored her completely. And then came the first open act of rebellion. A man named Thompson, middle-aged, quiet, retired, refused to pay his latest HOA fine. Karen tried to make an example of him. She had her patrol post a bright red, "property in violation" sign in his yard. But the next morning, every neighbor on the street removed their own HOA signs in solidarity. The silent fear that had bound them was gone. And Karen, she could feel it unraveling. From my cameras, I saw her pacing near her car late at night, phone pressed to her ear, arguing with someone I couldn't see. Her voice, once sharp and composed, now cracked under pressure. The image of control was dissolving, and behind it stood a woman terrified of losing her throne. But she wasn't finished fighting. 3 days later, I received a notice, this time, not from the HOA, but from a local law firm. A civil suit. The charges? Defamation, interference with community operations, and illegal surveillance. Classic Karen. When power fails, manipulation follows. She wanted to bury me under legal pressure, hoping I'd fold or move out quietly. But she made one fatal mistake: she underestimated who she was dealing with. I'd faced interrogations, investigations, and covert operations far more complex than a suburban legal scare tactic. Paper threats didn't shake me. They just gave me more reason to push harder. So I compiled everything. Every document. Every financial inconsistency. Every photo, timestamp, email, and recorded pattern of harassment. It was all there, a detailed trail of abuse, coercion, and corruption. Enough to dismantle not just her authority, but the entire HOA structure. When I filed a counterclaim with the state regulatory board, I didn't just accuse her of fraud, I proved it. The evidence was overwhelming. The next day, the neighborhood woke to chaos. Emails circulated. Screenshots leaked. Karen's personal messages to her board members, mocking residents, bragging about fines, plotting disciplinary tactics, were now public. The fallout was instant. Her assistants resigned. One of the board members turned on her, claiming he'd been pressured into compliance. The landscaper she'd been funneling payments to confessed it was all staged. The empire had fallen. But power doesn't die quietly. Karen went into overdrive, door to door, pleading her case, trying to twist the story. She called emergency HOA meetings, issued statements blaming false information and digital manipulation. But no one believed her anymore. The neighbors she once controlled now watched from a distance, their eyes cold, their smiles gone. She was the queen of a kingdom that no longer existed. Meanwhile, my counter-report had been forwarded to the county attorney. Investigators arrived within days. Clipboards, badges, official cars. They interviewed residents, collected statements, reviewed documents. It was no longer a neighborhood drama. It was a legal case. The moment the investigators showed up at her doorstep, Karen's facade cracked completely. My cameras captured it all: the trembling hands, the forced smile, the nervous pacing. Her empire of intimidation was collapsing in real time. But what struck me most wasn't victory. It was how fragile power really is, how quickly control turns to chaos when the truth steps into the light. Still, I wasn't celebrating. Not yet. Because people like Karen don't vanish easily. They regroup. They adapt. They find new ways to survive. And I had a feeling she wasn't done. That night, I sat in my study, reviewing footage, when my motion alert triggered. Someone was standing in my driveway. Alone. Karen. Her clipboard was gone. Her polished smile replaced by desperation. She didn't knock. She just stood there, staring at my house, motionless. For a moment, I almost felt pity. Almost. But then, she pulled something from her bag, a document. She slipped it under my door and walked away. No words. No confrontation. Just silence. When I opened the door, the paper lay folded neatly on the mat. It wasn't a threat this time. It was a resignation letter. Effective immediately, it read, "I hereby step down as president of the Maplewood Estates HOA." No signature. No reason. Just an ending. Or so it seemed. The next morning, the neighborhood gathered outside the community center. Someone had posted a message board for updates, and at the top, in bold letters, it said, "HOA temporarily suspended pending investigation." Maplewood Estates was finally free. The weight that had hung over the neighborhood for months lifted. Kids played again. People smiled again. For the first time since moving in, my wife and I felt like we belonged. But beneath that peace, I couldn't shake a thought: Karen had disappeared too quietly. No confrontation, no apology, no closure. And when someone like her goes silent, it's never over. So I stayed alert. Cameras on. Records safe. Eyes open. Because I knew this story wasn't finished. And sometimes, the most dangerous battles begin after the war is won. For weeks, Maplewood Estates lived in rare peace. The lawn stayed green, the mailboxes quiet, and the endless stream of HOA notices had finally stopped. The neighborhood that once walked in fear now laughed in the open again. Kids played basketball in the driveways. Neighbors stopped to chat instead of hiding behind curtains. My wife smiled more. She even started planting flowers by the front porch, something she hadn't done since the first week we moved in. It almost felt normal. But normal doesn't last long when someone like Karen disappears without a trace. The investigators had wrapped up their report, confirming multiple ethics violations within the HOA. The board was officially dissolved, pending legal review. Karen's name was mentioned, but she hadn't been charged, at least, not yet. She'd vanished before the papers even hit her doorstep. For most people, that was the end. But for me, it was the silence afterward that bothered me. Because silence, true silence, is never peace. It's preparation. And Karen Davenport was the kind of woman who never accepted defeat. The first sign came quietly. A new face moved into the vacant house 2 streets over. A woman in her late 30s, polite, charming, well-spoken. My wife met her at the grocery store. She said her name was Janet. But when I checked the county records later that night, the property hadn't changed ownership. It had been leased, under a management company owned by one of Karen's old associates. Coincidence? Maybe. But I didn't believe in coincidences anymore. The next sign came a few days later, a small detail, easy to miss. A community improvement survey appeared in every mailbox. Printed in color, with a familiar format. Questions about restoring neighborhood standards and rebuilding a better future. No HOA logo this time, just a generic title, the Maplewood Renewal Project. I knew that tone. The words. The structure. The manipulation disguised as care. Karen was back. But she wasn't coming through the front door this time. She was coming through the cracks, quietly, strategically, pretending to be something new. I could have ignored it. Pretended peace was enough. But I'd made that mistake once before, overseas, when we thought the threat was gone, only to watch it rise again from the shadows. Not this time. I started monitoring again. Same patterns, same signs. Janet hosted small neighborhood get-togethers, coffee mornings, casual chats, barbecues in her backyard. Nothing official, but the attendees were always the same, former HOA members, the ones who had stayed loyal to Karen until the end. It was rebuilding, piece by piece, out of sight. So I went quiet too. I played the part of the friendly neighbor. Attended one of their gatherings, just to listen. The tone was civil, warm even, but beneath the smiles I could hear the subtext: we need order again, the community needs structure, some people need to follow the rules. They never said my name. They didn't have to. I knew exactly who some people meant. Over the next few days, small things began to change. Notices returned, not from an HOA, but from the Maplewood Renewal Committee. Unofficial, unsigned, but clearly coordinated. Trash bins slightly moved from their place. Lawn tools missing, then returned. Someone spray-painted a message on the old HOA signboard: we'll rebuild. It wasn't vandalism. It was a message. Karen wasn't just back, she was watching. Testing. Probing. Waiting for me to react. But this time, I wasn't playing defense. I knew how insurgencies worked. When they couldn't win by force, they won by illusion. By making their target feel surrounded, uncertain, exhausted. So I didn't react. Not yet. I observed. I gathered. And that's when the real twist hit. One night, my wife came home visibly shaken. She'd received a letter at her work, no return address. Inside, a single page. You married a man who brings war wherever he goes. Maybe he should have stayed on the battlefield. That wasn't random. That was personal. A direct strike. Karen had finally shown her hand. It wasn't about control anymore. It was revenge. That night, I pulled every camera feed I had, checked every motion log, reviewed every angle. And there, at 3:17 a.m., I caught it. A shadow moving by our backyard fence. Tall, careful, avoiding the light. When the figure stepped forward, the camera caught just enough, blonde hair tied back, pale windbreaker. Karen. After all this time, she'd returned herself. No assistance, no board, no mask of authority. Just her, desperate, angry, reckless. She was testing boundaries again. Trying to see if I'd still stand my ground. But she didn't know that this time, I was ready for her. I contacted the same investigators who had handled the first case. Sent them everything: footage, letters, patterns. I didn't want confrontation. I wanted closure. Real, legal, permanent closure. 2 days later, law enforcement arrived. They searched her rental property. What they found made everything clear. Stacks of documents. Fake committee letters. Draft HOA bylaws with her name still embedded in the metadata. A complete blueprint for reinstating the HOA under a new identity, and a list of priority targets. My name was at the top. It was over. Karen Davenport was arrested that evening for harassment, fraud, and violation of multiple court orders. The neighborhood gathered outside as the police cars pulled away. The woman who once ruled this place with an iron clipboard now sat in the back of a cruiser, silent, defeated, small. For the first time in months, I exhaled. But the feeling wasn't triumph. It was relief. Because this war, one that started with simple rules and ended in obsession, had finally reached its end. Karen wasn't a villain in her own mind. She truly believed she was saving the community. That's what made her dangerous. Control disguised as care. Authority wrapped in good intentions. And for people like her, losing power felt worse than losing purpose. That night, as I stood on my porch watching the patrol lights fade, I realized something important. This was never about lawns or dues or regulations. It was about freedom, and the lengths people will go to destroy it in the name of order. Maplewood Estates was free again. But freedom always comes with a price. As the wind moved through the quiet streets, I looked at my wife and knew one thing for certain: we weren't just homeowners anymore. We were survivors. Peace feels strange when you've lived too long in chaos. For the first few mornings after Karen's arrest, I woke up expecting something to go wrong: a letter in the mailbox, a car parked too long outside, a familiar shadow by the fence. But nothing came. The air was quiet. The neighborhood was still. For the first time in months, the silence didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like healing. Neighbors began reclaiming what they'd lost. The Petersons finally built that treehouse they'd postponed for years. Mrs. Daniels painted her door red again, her favorite color, the one Karen had once banned for being too loud. It was almost poetic, watching the neighborhood breathe again. But even as life returned, a part of me stayed alert. Because I'd learned something in my years of service, and Karen had only confirmed it: control never dies easily. When you take it away from someone who lives on power, they'll spend their whole life trying to get it back. Karen was gone, yes, but her idea wasn't. Her documents, her bylaws, her rules for better living still floated around in inboxes and paper trails. They'd been copied, shared, whispered about. And someday, someone else could try to use them again. That's why I decided not to leave. We could have sold the house, started fresh somewhere else. But no, this was home now. Not because of the bricks or the land, but because of the lesson it carried. You don't walk away from a storm just because it's past. You stay, and you rebuild stronger. So I stayed. Every morning, I made coffee on the same porch where Karen once stood lecturing me about lawn height. The same spot where she'd accused me of being unfit for this community. Now it was quiet. The only sound was the hum of the wind chimes my wife hung up the day after the arrest, a small symbol of freedom. But one afternoon, a letter came. No stamp, no name. Just one line typed in the center. You were right. It wasn't signed, but I knew. The tone. The phrasing. It was Karen's. From jail, she'd somehow managed to send it through someone else. I read it once, twice. Then I folded it neatly, walked to the backyard, and burned it. Because this time, I didn't need answers. Karen's story wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about understanding. Understanding how easily control can corrupt. How good intentions can become poison when mixed with ego. And maybe, deep down, that letter wasn't a threat. Maybe it was her way of admitting defeat, or even seeking peace. Either way, it didn't matter. The neighborhood's new association was formed, not an HOA, but a community council, built on transparency. No dues, no fines, no forced rules. Just people talking, helping, protecting what was theirs. They asked me to lead it. I said no. Because leadership wasn't what Maplewood needed anymore. It needed balance. It needed memory. So instead, I stood behind the scenes, the quiet watcher, the same way I used to in my military days, making sure no one abused power again. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't about one neighborhood. It was a reflection of everything wrong with control itself. The moment one person starts believing they know what's best for everyone else, that's when freedom dies. Karen wasn't the first to believe that, and she wouldn't be the last. But for now, at least, Maplewood was safe. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, I looked around, the laughter, the kids, the smell of backyard grills, the hum of normal life returning. It felt earned. My wife joined me on the porch, holding 2 mugs of coffee. She didn't have to say anything. Her smile said it all, the quiet pride of surviving something that tried to break us. And as we watched the neighborhood lights flicker on, I thought about the war that had started over nothing more than a homeowner's rulebook, and ended up becoming a battle for identity, trust, and truth. That's the thing about people like Karen. They don't start out villains. They start out believing they're right. Believing they're helping. Until one day, they forget the difference between order and control. That's the lesson Maplewood had to learn the hard way. And maybe, that's the lesson every community eventually faces. Because no matter how perfect a place looks on the outside, it's never really peaceful until people inside it learn to let go of power and start trusting one another again. That's what freedom is. Not the absence of rules, but the presence of respect. As the night grew quiet, I locked the door, shut off the porch light, and took one last look outside. The street was calm. The wind carried laughter instead of whispers. The same place that once tried to control us had become a place that finally understood us. And in that moment, I realized something I never had before. Maybe this wasn't just the end of a story. Maybe it was the beginning of a better one. Because sometimes, you don't win by fighting back. You win by standing still and refusing to bend. And that's exactly what we did. Maplewood survived. We survived. And the next time someone like Karen tries to rise again, we'll be ready. They tried to force us to join their HOA. They thought they knew who we were. But in the end, they found out the hard way, we were never the ones who needed rules. They were.